all hearing crazy things about food shortages that are coming. Even Biden himself has spoken of this. He said, brother, it's coming.
With regard to food shortage, yes, we did talk about food shortages. And it's going to be real.
We are seeing efforts to control food production. We're seeing attacks on our infrastructure. We're seeing attacks on the economy. We are seeing attacks on humanity in general. This episode is going to be very practical indeed. I've had this growing feeling that I am doing the Posse, that I'm doing listeners to this show a disservice if I am not telling them, giving them the very practical advice to prepare for the zombie apocalypse, otherwise known as the Democrat apocalypse. Welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences, and it is my great pleasure to have with me my friend, my brother in arms, my colleague, Jim Ferguson. And the reason I've asked Jim to join me is not only is Jim a very good friend of mine and just someone I enjoy chatting with, but because Jim is, and he might resist this particular label, but for lack of a better one, he is a prepper. I mean, Jim really has kind of mastered this. He sort of has it down to an art. And rather than me just sitting here and speculating with you about how some of these things might be done, I thought it would be best to have Jim come and join us from the Scottish Highlands and discuss this. How are you doing, Jim?
I'm doing great, Larry. Thanks very much indeed for having me on your show. Yeah, it's been great to see you again.
Well, how do you feel about the term prepper? I mean, most people think of prepping as these are tinfoil hat people. But these days, I think it's kind of a necessity to have some level of preparedness, not just simply because of what might come from globalist mandates, which I do believe are coming. But I mean, just today, just in my own home, we had a power outage due to a storm. So some level of preparation is important. I was going to come and see you earlier this year, but a snowstorm prevented that. So don't you agree with me that some kind of preparation for the unexpected is necessary?
Absolutely. I think the term prepper has probably been misused in so many ways. I mean, if you think about our grandparents, they were preppers. They had to be because they didn't have 24-hour supermarkets open 24/7. They had pantries and they would put their shopping into that, and they would always have a little bit of a stock of food in case, in particular in the likes of the Highlands, when we didn't have snow plows and we didn't have ways of getting to the stores so easily, especially in the remoter parts of the Highlands, people had to have pantries and they had to have enough food to last them maybe over a longer period because of the snow drifts, and there was nothing to clear the snow as easy as it is today. So the term prepper is probably more of an American type of term, but I think that it's sometimes it's misunderstood. And of course, there are people that go to extreme lengths in things like that as well. But I think in an uncertain world where we just need to look at the Middle East, we just need to look at what's going on with Israel and Hamas. We just need to look at what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. And what we did witness during the last pandemic was very, very serious effects of shipping containers being not berthed at container ports. I mean, I remember seeing some of the largest container ports in the United States with, hundreds of ships berthed where they couldn't get their cargoes unloaded, which led to shortage of certain things. So I think the term prepping is sensible prepping. We're not talking about stockpiling. We're not talking about hoarding. We're not talking about anything like that. We're talking about sensible precautions, just in case there might be a delay. And we have seen that. And as you quite correctly said, some of the politicians, the president himself of America has said, you should be prepared. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And it's like, I suppose, if anybody hasn't thought along these lines before, it can be a daunting thought, Larry. But actually, it's quite a simple thing for people to start doing. If they start small and work their way up to where they need to go with it. And the great thing about prepping is that it gives the people that do that a little bit of peace of mind. They don't seem to have that same sort of fear factor. They know that they're going to be all right for a little while until whatever the calamity is past, until the power's back on, or whatever it might be that's caused the problem in the first place.
I agree with that. And I like the way you put it, that our grandparents, our great grandparents, our ancestors, they were all, at least by the modern definition, would be deemed to be preppers. And that is because they didn't have the transportation to go into town. They were often on farms, fairly isolated. A trip to town was a big deal and didn't happen with great frequency. And in many cases, they were fairly self sufficient anyway. So they were always, stockpiling some kind of food, meat, access to water, clean water wells, things of this nature were very common for them to have. But I also think, in a recent conversation, I was teasing you, Jim, because you were talking about a heat wave in Scotland, which probably by the standards of those of us in the American South does not constitute actual heat. That said, you would laugh at us. You would laugh at us because it is a very common thing in the American South that whenever there's jokes about this, that whenever the weatherman says there is any threat of snow, which is fairly rare, and when we do get snow, it's a dusting. It's typically a light dusting. But there is a run on the grocery store, and for whatever reason, people attack two things. Well, three really: bread, milk, and beer. I mean, they all disappear straight off of the shelves with just the meat. The joke is that the meteorologists are getting kickbacks, from the grocery stores because all they need to do is to suggest there might be snow coming, and there are lines at the grocery store as though people think they're going to be snowed in, for weeks on end. And of course, that never happens in the American South. So seems to me that it's a wise thing to do. Let's just do it this way. The way we might organize this show is we'll just kind of go back and forth with some ideas here. But the first thing that comes to my mind, Jim, beyond food, and you have more to say on that than I do, so I'm gonna go to a different place. I think it is important that people have access to, if possible, to have access to a vehicle that is not computerized. To have access to an older vehicle, you can buy one pretty cheaply. That is, it doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be a big 4-wheel drive. It doesn't have to be a tank. You don't need to go get a Hummer, but that you have some means of being able to get around in a vehicle that is not dependent upon computers.
Yes, and there's a very good reason for that, a very practical reason for that. First of all, they're easier to maintain because, a mechanic, that's somebody that's got rudimentary skills to change spark plugs, for example, if it's a petrol engine, the oil filter, general maintenance, it's not difficult to do. Pop out the air filter, that's fine. The problem with some of the more modern high-tech vehicles is that you need a computer to analyze what's wrong with them. Even the best mechanic can't fix it because he's got to plug in a computer, he's got to plug in the device to actually read where the faults lie. And sometimes that computer will be needed to reset certain circuits and reset certain programs. But there's another very important reason why you would want an older vehicle, a more robust type vehicle. And that is simply because there are such things as EMP pulses, electromagnetic pulses, which can be used by a hostile nation. It's normally a nuclear burst, an air burst, fairly high up in the atmosphere, and of sufficient enough strength that will produce an EMP pulse. And that can cover a very large area. So, for example, if there was an EMP pulse detonated in the upper atmosphere of the United States, even one could knock out systems. And we've seen also examples of where sun flares can cause similar types of problems. Indeed, there was a very well-documented event happened in the United States when they were getting the telegraph wires were actually basically overheating and frying and melting. And it caused a lot of problems. Thankfully, they didn't and haven't had any major sun flare activity to that extent since. But if there was, then our systems are vulnerable. And, if it knocks out the stations, the electrical stations, the electrical grid, The problem is that there is no replacement backup generators or equipment to replace it quickly. So a major event, whether it was man-made as in an EMP pulse, or whether it was something more like a sun flare, could cause real devastating problems for the power grid. And it's estimated that it could knock out the what we all take for granted as power. We switch a plug on, we put something into the plug, we switch it on, and it works. Well, that might cease, not just for a few months, but potentially for 5 or 6 or 7 years to get the whole grid repaired and back up to running. So it's a major problem that people need to think about. Well, there are things that you can do to mitigate that. And for example, you take an older vehicle that's not so susceptible to electronic pulses of an EMP strike. That means that it's a little bit more likely to keep running if you have it there. But also, there are EMP shields that can be fitted to these vehicles. They're not that expensive. They can also be fitted to a fairly standard sized house as well, which will once again, up to a certain magnitude, protect your circuits, any equipment that's in the property from that happening. Some people even go to the length of building Faraday cages. Most nuclear bunkers, in fact, all nuclear bunkers, have what's called a Faraday cage in their makeup, and that stops the electromagnetic pulse from penetrating in and destroying electromagnetic waves and destroying electrical equipment and contained within it. Well, people can actually make those things themselves, and what a lot of people are doing is they're maybe making sure that they've got good communications. Could be two-way radios, could be ham radios, could be walkie-talkies or mobile phones. And what they do is they make a Faraday cage. So it's basically a box that's got a metal grid around it on all sides, and the equipment is placed inside that, and it's basically shut and closed over. It's very simple to do. It's not expensive to do it, but it does mean that the electrical equipment that you put in there is protected from a pulse wave, because you could have all the equipment in the world sitting on the shelf. You could have ham radios, walkie-talkies, all sorts of equipment. If a pulse goes off, it's not going to work. And it's the same for car engines. And if you actually happen to be out driving and all the cars suddenly stop, there's a very good indication that there's been a nuclear detonation somewhere in the atmosphere. It might not be anywhere near you that's going to cause you a problem, but if your vehicle stopped working just like that and everybody else's vehicles stopped working, there's a high chance that an EMP pulse has detonated somewhere.
Well,
so
and
those
also,
are some practical steps you can take.
Well, and also the Biden administration is trying to put everyone over onto electric, absolutely everything over to electric, your automobile, your house, so that you have a smart house in effect with their attack on propane, on natural gas, and they're mandating that automobiles have kill switches in them. So a more sinister possibility isn't just simply an attack from a foreign power, say Russia or China, but by your own government that just simply hits a switch and shuts you off, and shuts off your house, your access to electricity, your automobile, anything. Once it's electric, you're much more easily herded and controlled. So it's important that you have some measure of independence from these things. This is one of the more expensive things that we will list today, and you don't have to have it, but if possible, it's a good idea. Go and find yourself a Toyota from the year 2005 or something that you can bump around in if you need to, because you may need to have access to hospitals, to food, to other members of family. You just don't have any idea what your transportation needs are going to be. And to have something that isn't dependent upon electricity, I think, is very important. Let's go from there to talk, Jim, a little bit about food. Now, I know you've done a few things in this regard. I have. Interestingly enough, we have a new sponsor to our show, mypatriotsupply.com. Most emergencies come without warning, and when the next one comes, you won't have time to pack and prepare. You need to get ready now, before an emergency strikes. Your supplies should be ready to grab and to go right away. Secure those supplies at my website, preparewithideas.com. Start with 4-week emergency food kits from My Patriot Supply. Helping millions of Americans prepare since 2008, My Patriot Supply are experts in self-reliance. Their 4-week emergency food kits offer over 2,000 calories every day. Protected by heavy-duty 4-layer packaging, these kits last up to 25 years. Sealed inside rugged, handled buckets, they're made to grab quickly. Go to preparewithideas.com and save $50 per kit. They ship fast and free in unmarked boxes. Save $50 per kit at preparewithideas.com. I want to say this about My Patriot Supply. I was buying their stuff before I had any idea that they would be a sponsor to this show. And what they have are these incredible, they come in buckets. And there's all kinds of different meals that you can buy. The level of protein that you want in them, the vegetables that you want, whatever it is. They have a lot of these prepackaged meals that will last up to 25 years, probably longer. And I began buying some of these about a year ago just to keep in storage in case we should ever need them. And I've bought probably a year's supply is what I have. There are others like My Patriot Supply. I obviously recommend them because I think that what they're doing is really excellent. And excuse me, and I would suggest that people, if they don't use them, that they use something very similar to that, unless they're people who are doing it themselves. What do you say?
Well, yes. Once again, the advantage of having a few odds and ends around the house that could maybe last you 3 weeks or 3 months even. If you actually get to the point where you've got, say, 3 months worth of supplies and food and water and whatever else you might need in the house, you are probably in the 1% of the population. So
isn't that sad? That's startling.
Most people, it is, and that's another example of modern life. We live in what's called a just-in-time economy, where goods on the supermarket shelves, they get sort of down to the last few, tubs of butter or margarine or whatever it might be, and then the automated system automatically orders when it gets to a certain point, and that arrives and it's taken through by workers and it's put back onto the shelves just in time before it completely runs out. And it's a very, very detailed system that most modern supermarkets have. That just-in-time economy, and it applies to, and of course, the reason they do it, Larry, is because back in the day, they used to have warehouses full of stock. They might only get a delivery once a week or maybe twice a week if they were really lucky. So they needed to carry additional inventories of stock so that when the shelves were running low, they could take the stock back from the warehouse and put it into the front facing of the stores. But nowadays, if you look at Amazon, you can order something on Amazon, it's there the next day. And it's like they've got this massive transportation hub. It's very technical and it's very, very good until something causes a spanner to be thrown in the works, so to speak. And that's when the system goes down spectacularly. And it just takes something in the system. It could be a supply disruption. It could be a fuel price hike. It could be something that's maybe a container port that hasn't got the cargo unloaded yet. Something that causes those central distribution points to not be able to get that stock to the store for whatever reason. And because those stores do not carry inventory in any meaningful way, and one of the reasons they don't like to do it is because if you've got a warehouse attached to your supermarket that's absolutely filled with produce and stock, well, that's a huge amount of money that's tied up in there. So they like to just get in what they need in order to sell the last packet of whatever it is, pretty much, to the customer that buys it, and then they get the new stock in. But that makes the whole just-in-time economy really very fragile. But the kind of things that people want to avoid is if there ever is a situation that is tenuous, that is difficult, it could be a number of different scenarios. But let's just say that it's maybe a storm that's coming. Well, you don't want to be going outside in bad weather doing grocery shopping. if it's windy conditions, I mean, we don't get so much in the way of tornadoes in the UK, but the States, certain parts of the States certainly do. You don't want to be having to go to the shops in those conditions. Or if there was any kind of violent protests going on, I mean, we've just seen a whole pile of stuff happening in the United States with Hamas and Palestinian sympathizers and universities. We've seen the Black Lives Matter protest that was burning cities to the ground effectively. You don't want to be going out in those kind of conditions where people are going to be maybe taking what you've purchased. There's a risk to you. There's a risk to their family. So once again, if you have a modest amount of inventory, 3-4 weeks worth of food, or 3 months, then you can survive beyond whatever that situation is. And it means also you're not caught short. Let's face it, we've all got repair bills. Things can happen from time to time. And, you might have to buy a new fridge. You might have to buy a new washing machine that you didn't expect to have to purchase. Well, if you've got a little bit of stock of food set aside, you don't have to worry about going to the stores that week and maybe shopping. You've got enough to keep you going until next payday comes in or whatever it might be. And most people in the United States and most people in the UK are the same. They're kind of living from paycheck to paycheck a lot of the time. So when they have a big expense comes in, new tire, whatever it might be in the car, that can cause a bit of a problem. So once again, it's all about putting a little bit aside now and again. And the way to do it, Larry, is actually a lot more simpler than people think. You don't need to be some kind of expert or some kind of ex-military veteran or anything like that to know about survival or prepping. Ordinary people, as we discussed, our grandparents did this all the time. Our past generations, they did it all the time because they had to. So if you're going to the store, you just buy, maybe instead of 1 can of beans, you maybe buy 2. You maybe buy, an extra packet of flour or rice or whatever it might be, some kind of pulses, lentils, whatever. And then you start to, build up a little bit of a stock. So you've always got something in the house. And if you do that in a reasonable way, every time you go shopping, just buy that little bit extra without going completely silly about it, then you're going to be in a position where you eventually, in a fairly short space of time, you will have extra goods on hand. And sometimes people will they'll actually build a little pantry for themselves, or they'll start to get some shelves, or they'll put up some metal shelving or whatever it might be in a spare room, for example. And they'll just start to put that extra things on that shelf. And it's easy to see. It's easy to know what you've got. It's easy to do an inventory. And there are certain things that you need to keep an eye on, things like sell by date. So you want to put new produce in at the back, make sure that you're doing what's called stock rotation. But it's not that hard to do. And I would encourage everybody to do it.
Can your savings weather an economic storm? Think about what you've put away for the future. Inflation can render cash worthless. Real estate can crash like it did in 2008. Economies built on a mountain of debt fall like a house of cards. There are very few physical assets you can invest in that stand the test of time. Gold has stood as a valued form of money for millennia. It's why people are flocking to it now and why Birch Gold is busier than ever. Through a little-known tax loophole, Birch Gold lets you convert a retirement account into a tax-sheltered IRA in physical gold. And the best part is it doesn't cost you a penny out of pocket. To learn more, text IDEAS to 989898 and claim your free info kit on gold. Let me ask you this again. Can your IRA or 401k weather an economic storm? If not, call the people I trust, Birch Gold. Text IDEAS to 989898 and secure your savings today. Well, yes, and I would add to that, Jim, pardon me, but you're absolutely right. This is a simple thing to do. You can just go buy a few things extra each time you go out. That's very simple. And as I say, mypatriotsupply.com, you can find a lot of this stuff there. That's terrific. There are others who do this as well. You can also explore. These days, you can find on platforms like this, YouTube, you can find people who can explain to you how to go about doing some of these things. on your own. But in case you're listening to this and you think, golly, these guys sound like a couple of crackpots. I mean, sounds like something, this sounds like something just absolutely insane. This will not happen. Well, of course, it does happen around the world frequently with natural disasters. I dare say that many people were caught during lockdowns with insufficient goods at that particular time. So there you have a government imposed kind of prepper sort of situation. But I'll go beyond that. Maybe you've seen the headlines, as I certainly have, of billionaires who are building bunkers. Have you seen this? Building bunkers all
Yeah.
over the world. You have guys like Mark Zuckerberg, who is building a palatial bunker in Hawaii. Peter Thiel, the one of the founders of PayPal in New Zealand, and they're just the tip of the iceberg, which indicates to you they seem to know something that perhaps the rest of us don't know, but they are preparing for a kind of apocalyptic scenario. And I think we would be unwise if we didn't tell, unkind, certainly, if we didn't tell our listeners that these are situations they need to take very, very seriously. And we're not telling you to go out and stockpile all kinds of weapons, though I do think it's important to have one and know how to use one. We can certainly add that to the list, but that it is important just as I take it seriously. I know you do, Jim. As a husband and as a father, I take the care and the protection of my family very seriously, and having some rudimentary things, which is what we're talking about here. If you're in a more advanced kind of situation, you have the means to build your own bunker, then more power to you. But we're just talking about making sure that in any kind of emergency situation that arises, that you have access to food, you have access to clean water. You might have enough, not just for yourself, but undoubtedly you'll discover you're one of the few people, if such a situation arises, that actually does have some of these things. And you might be prepared to have enough to actually share with other people, having access to medical supplies. If you are a diabetic, insulin, do you have it? Are there other kinds of medications that you don't have, that you may need on a regular basis? Get them. Antibiotics. These are all basic necessities just for life on a daily basis. And if it turns out that we're wrong and you never do have to use any of these things, wonderful. You have I like the way you put it, Jim. It provides peace of mind. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, because if you should find yourself, to use an American expression, with your pants down in a situation like this, that won't be good.
Well, that's true, and you've raised another very important point, Larry. And I mean, I've heard of Patriot Supplies. I think they are an American company. They're very, very good. They're very popular. I'm not sure if they operate in the UK. I'll probably need to find out about that. There are other sort of, in particular, freeze dried goods, and we'll maybe explain a little bit about the difference between dehydrated and freeze dried and tin goods as well, because people will come across that and they might not necessarily understand what the difference is and why one might be more expensive than the other. But yes, it's a very, very important point. And yes, I have heard about Mark Zuckerberg and his bunker that's been built. There's I think there's been a bit of an influx going into New Zealand for some reason. I think they've maybe thought New Zealand is far enough away from where the major population centres, if there was a nuclear exchange, for example, between America and Russia, they're thinking they're far enough away down there. And in many ways, they might be right, except that New Zealand is highly volcanic. They have volcanoes there, they have earthquakes there, and they do get tornadoes coming down there. So we've seen some big earthquakes going off, I think, in places like Christchurch, where, a bunker might be, if it's properly built, might be all right, but it might not be. So if I was to say, locations, I think I might go somewhere else. But actually, I think that it's all about approaching this in a down to earth, sensible, pragmatic way, because there are some people who have been into this prepping stuff for a long, long time. And there are some people that are very, very, very advanced. There are people that have bunkers out there, and not just people like Mark Zuckerberg. There are people that have maybe smaller bunkers out there. I certainly don't have a bunker, but at the end of the day, there are people out there that do. They're well stocked. They're usually in very remote locations. And of course, one of the things that people need to think about if they're going down that route is where they're going to situate it.
The information I'm about to share with you might shock you. Right now, there is a silent epidemic affecting 100 million Americans that nobody wants to talk about. It's called fatty liver. We throw everything at our livers: cholesterol, alcohol, toxins, heavy metals, statins, cigarettes. That's why so many of us have a sluggish, fatty liver that makes us gain weight and lose energy. Fatty liver also affects our sleep quality and may be a risk to our heart health. That's why it's important to start protecting your liver today. You can do so with Liver Health Formula. It's an all-natural supplement which contains 11 clinically proven botanicals that help recharge and protect your liver. This company already has helped more than 2 million fellow Americans with their products. Try Liver Health Formula by going to getliverhelp.com/Larry and claim your free bonus gift. That's getliverhelp.com/Larry.
But even if we're not talking about bunkers, because that is in a whole other realm, if we're just talking about sensible precautions, here's another good reason, and you mentioned it just a few minutes ago, and that was antibiotics. And what people maybe don't realize in the United States or even in other places around the world is that the largest manufacturer of antibiotics is China. And China is no friend to the United States. They are economic and military rivals. And indeed, 90%, about 90% of the antibiotics that come into the United States come from China. Doxycycline, amoxicillin, penicillin, all the different types of antibiotics that do different things and are used for different reasons. And it's important that people understand that. Now, in the United States, you can buy antibiotics. And on my channel, I have links to companies that will actually allow you to do that. And because I'm on your channel, I won't name it. But at the same time, there are ways of doing that quite legally. And they do provide very comprehensive documentation as to what these particular antibiotics can be used for and how to use them. So they come from a medical background company, and they are very, very proficient. And if you are an American, you should take advantage of the fact that you can get these things, because in the UK, you can't. They would need to be prescribed by a doctor. And it's probably unlikely that a doctor is going to prescribe you antibiotics for a what-if scenario, unfortunately. And I do mean that, unfortunately. So, take advantage of the fact that if you're in the United States, you can get these things quite legally, quite ethically, and have them on hand. And I remember not that long ago, actually during the pandemic, I had a bit of a tooth abscess. And anybody that's ever had an abscess in their tooth will know how painful that can be. And, I had to go and get that drained, and I actually ended up getting the tooth pulled, but they were able to put me on antibiotics, and it cleared up that abscess. But you can imagine, I think it might have been Napoleon that talked about toothache being one of the worst things that could happen to you. I could be wrong in saying that, but I think it might have been. You could maybe check, Larry. You're the researcher.
Well, here's the funny thing. Napoleon there's a book called Napoleon Speaks. As a historian, it's just one of the weird, trivial things that I should know. And here's the funny thing about it, Jim. He says so many things on so many different topics that if he didn't say what you just said, he said something very similar to it. Continue.
Lovely. I love that. I'll remember that next time I'm quoting it. I'll say that as well. But I think it might have been. But toothache is a terrible thing. It's very debilitating. And if you can imagine, if you're in a situation in a pandemic, and there was no antibiotics, you're in a lot of pain. It can just stop you in your tracks, and it can come on really quite suddenly. So if you had an antibiotic, it's not going to cure the abscess necessarily, because you've got to go to a dentist to get that drilled and drained. But what it will do is it will buy you some time. And that's the whole ethos of preppers. It buys you some time to get to the store when it's safe, to get to the garage, to get that thing fixed when you can get there, or to get some medical help that might not be immediately available. The hospitals might be overrun for some reason, or they might be destroyed or incapacitated for some other reason. So you're buying some time. It might not necessarily be the end all and the solution, but if it buys you enough time, that's the crucial point. And it's the same with food and water. And we can talk a bit more in detail, whatever way you want to take this, in terms of discussion, Larry. But these are things that are worth having on hand.
Well, in the time that we have remaining, let's move fairly rapidly through just some basic things that people should have. So they should have some food. We've talked about ways that they can begin to acquire some food stocks. We've made reference to the fact that they can get access to water. Again, you can buy a lot of this online in very large, not just the bottles, but in the much larger containers. Water filtration systems are easily accessible. Some of you can have access to your own clean water wells, or if you live near a lake or a stream, you can get access to that, and there are ways of purifying that, all things that you can discover online. I also think that it's a good idea to have, if possible, this is another, a high value item, but if it's possible to have it, a generator is important. And then I'll add this as well, and that is a fireplace. I am a major believer in fireplaces being a basic necessity in a home. And these days, I don't know how it is in the UK, but in the United States, most homes do not have them. And if they do have them, they're gas or propane, and they don't put out an awful lot of heat. They're mostly aesthetic. I think having a real fireplace, you don't have to redesign your whole house in order to do this. You can simply have a fire pit, which you can buy online. There are a number of stores that sell them here in the United States, a place called Tractor Supply. They sell them. And because having access to heat and the ability to cook your food, if need be, this is, in my mind, is quite vital. And that means also having firewood. So those are just a few things that come to my mind. What do you say, Jim?
It's a very, very good point. In fact, most houses, new homes that are built in the UK, are not built with what we would call coal fire or open fireplaces. They're either connected to the gas or they're electrical powered only. And you're at a major disadvantage if the power goes out for any prolonged length of time. Once again, look back in our history to our ancestors, especially those in the Scottish Highlands. They all had what was called either rayburns or agas. These were ranges where you could basically put coal or firewood or whatever you could get. Aga stoves, and they're great things because not only can you cook on them, but they heat the whole house,
Yeah, they're incredible.
And, they are. I mean, they're expensive, but I mean, at the end of the day, these are kind of things that if you're going into in a slightly deeper way, you might want to consider. But remember also, even if you are living in a house that doesn't have an open fire and you couldn't effectively cook in it, a lot of people do have barbecues. So, I mean, a barbecue can be turned into a way to cook food as well. And I think one of the things that I'm keen for people to understand is that it's very, very simple to do, and it doesn't have to be expensive or beyond your budget. And the more that people do it, the more protected you are around you. If everybody's prepared around you, then there's less of a threat to you. And that's one of the reasons I would always encourage people to have a little bit of extra provision. Because I'll give you, maybe sort of finish off by saying this. The MI5, which is the British security services, the internal security services and the apparatus that goes with it. About 25 years ago, I think I might have told you this when I was sitting on your porch smoking a cigar and having a glass of wine when I was there, Larry. But 25 years ago, they came out with a headline on the front of the Times of London. And it said, Britain or the Brits are about, I'm paraphrasing slightly because I can't remember exactly what they said, but they said something along the lines of 7 meals away from societal breakdown. So what they were really saying was, if a normal family goes for 7 consecutive meals absent, that they don't eat, that changes them fundamentally in their mind. The brain chemistry changes. They start to look at things very differently. And they take on a very hard and a very almost predatory view of those around them. They start to look at their neighbors differently.
Mm-hmm.
They start to think, where am I going to get the food from? And you don't want to be surrounded by people like that, that are caught short, as you say in the Americans, with their pants down. You don't want to be near people who get caught with their pants down, because they can be very dangerous people. And they are almost become desperate to feed themselves and their families. So the more you encourage people in moderate ways to have a few extra supplies, the more safe everybody actually is in the long run. And it's not so hard, Start small, build it up gradually, and before you know it, you'll have your 3 weeks, and then your next goal is your 3 months worth of supplies to hand. And there's all sorts of things, looking at food, water, medical supplies, a good first aid kit, a few extra cans of fuel. Don't stock large amounts of petrol. Diesel, yeah, you're fine. And even if it is petrol for the lawnmower or the chainsaw or whatever you're using, that can be preserved for up to 3 years with additive that can be put into it. So there's lots of things that can be done that's practical.
I want to encourage everyone to join our newsletter. That's join.larrytaunton.com. Now, why is that important? Well, because it helps us to maintain contact with you apart from big tech. So whenever there's a new interview, a podcast, a video short, a live, we have the ability to contact you directly without going through big tech. So you can join that by going to join.larrytaunton.com. Yeah, what we're doing here is we're just touching on some of these points. We really don't have the time to drill down into each of these in any kind of great detail, but you can go online and find out any one of these. And we're trying to give you just sort of a rudimentary checklist. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but we're just touching on a few things to spark your thinking on this issue, because I believe it's incredibly important. So a couple more that I'll add here as we close. I've already mentioned that I believe that it's important that you have a means of protecting yourself. If you're not comfortable in using a gun, learn how to use one. There are many courses in the United States. The NRA offers a number of courses. I've taken theirs at least twice, maybe 3 times. It's the same thing, but I often find it useful to go back through the course again as a refresher, to remind myself, if you're afraid of weapons, it's not a good thing. You need to become comfortable with them. You need to understand how to use one, how to use it proficiently. And that doesn't mean that you have to, enjoy hunting or sporting or even using them. But it is important that you are not afraid of them and that you know how to use one proficiently. That's important. And then I would say this. I think it's important to have books. I am increasingly, I early on, Jim, I don't know if this was true for you, but I was initially drawn to electronic books. And I was, because I travel so much, as you know, and the idea of taking something like a Kindle that's this size and could hold as many as, say, 3,000 books, so that I, as a researcher, as a writer, could at any moment have access to a whole plethora of my own books, my library, that appealed to me. But then the newness of it wore off for me by degrees. First, because I like writing in my books. Second, because I don't know if you're like this, but for me, I can see the pages of books I've read, and I may not know the page number, but I know where it is. And so when I'm referencing it, I can go into my library and flip to roughly where what I'm looking for is. You can't do that with an electronic book, which is annoying. Excuse me. I know people say you search them, but I don't like doing that. Then I noticed that they're editing your books. A lot of people don't know this, but when you do these upgrades, what I want to call them, the software upgrades, they will reach into your library and change things in your library. Now, I didn't like this because they do it without you really knowing, unless you're reading what is included in the fine print of every upgrade. Usually, what they're changing are errors, typographical errors, historical errors. But it was kind of unnerving to me that they can reach into my library and remove whole paragraphs or something of that nature. But then, thirdly, we are now moving into the electronic book burning stage. That is where the globalists are. They want to control the censorship. They want to control what you read, what you have access to. Soon they'll hit your Netflix or libraries. In some sense, they're already doing this with old movies that they don't want you to see, or that they think are racist, or do not support the perverse sexual agenda, whatever it is. So I think it is important, particularly in the case of a power outage, that you have access to real books. And those might just be books for your entertainment, your own edification. But they also might be books, and I have several of these that I began to acquire as a child that were like Boy Scout books that
Yeah.
are very basic things, from how to tie knots to how to make a fishing pole to how to get access to clean water to knowing what you can and can't eat in the forest, and very, very practical things. These are not expensive. You can go online and find used booksellers. You don't have to have, they don't have to buy them new. You can buy some of these for $2, $3. Watch the shipping. A lot of them nail you on the shipping charges. You think the book is $3, then you discover it's $8 shipping or something like that. But many of them are not like that. I think having access to a good reference library that can help you in a pinch figure out the things you need to know when you can't get ready access online. Do you agree with me?
100%. And indeed, I have a library myself. I don't mean a big fancy library, with chairs and things. I just mean I have a little, a little library of books on things like gardening and planting seeds and propagating, and how and medical books as well, because you never know. As I say, you never know what lies in the future. We take a lot of things for granted, as we've spoken about the just-in-time economy, but the same thing applies to our medical care. We know that if we break our leg, well, it's not a problem. You just phone up the ambulance, they'll take you through and they'll fix your leg. But back in the day, that wasn't the case. If you had an accident like that, it was pretty serious. Cuts, keeping wounds clean, having fresh linen and bandages and things like that can, because even a small cut that gets infected, if you're in a situation where you don't have access to medical care, I mean, you travel a lot, you go to a lot of countries, and you will have seen that their medical care system is maybe not quite as good or advanced as it would be in the sort of first world countries. And a cut in the hand or a cut in your leg that gets infected, that can be a life-taking situation. So practical steps, knowing what to do, Larry, I think is absolutely right. I would definitely encourage people to get books and have a little collection of different books on different subjects that can teach you. And I used to be a Boy Scout, so I think I can still remember all my knots, just about.
You know, I'm mindful, you're talking about a small cut. Maybe 10 years ago, I got a hangnail, just a hangnail, and it was annoying me. So
Yeah.
I pulled it out, and over the course of the next few days, my finger became quite red, and then before long, I could feel it really throbbing, and it's so much so that it was difficult for me to sleep. Just that little thing.
Right.
But being of the mentality of our generation, I just thought, Larry, you need to man up and push through this. Well, then I'm at a party, and a physician friend of mine sees my finger, and he looks startled, and he says, Larry, we're going to be looking at amputating your hand if you do not let me prescribe you some antibiotics immediately. That's just to
Yeah.
reinforce the point you simply made. Just something as small as that, not having,
Yeah.
imagine being in a scenario, and I've certainly been in them
Yeah.
in Africa and South America, where I would not have had ready access to things like that. That's the importance of it. Jim, it has been a pleasure to have you on the show today. You're a prince of a guy. And I look forward to more discussions on this. You can find Jim, tell people where they can find you.
Sure. Well, I mean, if you go to freedomtraininternational.org, I'm the founder of Freedom Train, which is a freedom movement. We talk about a lot of things similar to what we're talking about here. And also on X, or Twitter as it used to be known as, Jim Ferguson UK. We're pretty easy to find. So, Larry, it's been an absolute pleasure to be on with you again. Thank you so much indeed. It's been
Well, and you
a real
can
eye-opener, I think.
well, and you can occasionally find him on my porch smoking a cigar. So we'll look forward to doing that
right.
again. Jim, thank you so much for joining me. You take care.
All the best. Thank you.
This has been Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.